Hi, everyone. This is Brian. Hunter Hartley on my left, George Clemens on the other end from me. Hunter is presenting the PowerPoint presentation this evening. And so I think we're just going to take a couple of minutes to check in with each other, and I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Hunter and take it away.
Thanks, Brian. The presentation is titled Energy as a Commons, working within the framework that we've been following for the past few weeks, integral co-evolution. This is something that I've spent a lot of time prior to getting involved as a group studying, and it's something that I have a good background in, and so I wanted to take the time to delve into that perspective in order to inform the group and moving forward inform our work. And just checking in on where I am. I actually had an interesting morning and kind of it required a dealing with a conflict with another individual and attempting to resolve it. And so it's been kind of a high energy and stressful day. So I'm now on the later end of that and still kind of feeling the effects of the amount of energy I had to invest into that and kind of feeling tired, but at the same time being excited about what it is that I'm going to be presenting, because it really does. The topic means a lot to me, and knowing how it affects our decisions moving forward, really want to do my best.
I look forward to this presentation. Interested in seeing this one.
I too am just looking forward to being able to sit back a little bit, tune in my listening skills and abilities, be the best listener that I can be. Hunter and I also, for a little part of the day, had an opportunity to work together on a phone conference. That was pretty interesting for me anyway, pretty interesting exercise. And so it's as the group work continues, the saga unfolds for us, I think, commanding our best energies and attention. And as always, I'm grateful to be in such good company.
Did we want to take a moment to do a minute or two or three of stillness before we?
Why don't we have time to do that?
Great. I'll start a timer.
So let's make so we've got things set up. We've been working with the format, case clinic format, in the last couple of weeks to make some adjustments, make sure that we really preserve the reflective aspect of practice through our work together. So we're going to take just a couple of minutes of stillness and before we actually get into the presentation.
Okay. A quick overview of the case clinic format, which we've been using. Started with a moment of stillness to co-sense into the shared social field. And from there, we move on to the intention statement given by the case giver, which is me, which is an outline of the situation, stakeholders' intention, learning threshold, and where we need help. Everyone else participating takes on the role of coaches who listen deep and ask clarifying questions. And so we'll begin there. So the key challenge that we're up against really requires some understanding about energy consumption, and in particular, I'm looking at oil and the production and consumption. On the left, you'll see a graph that shows the number of discoveries per decade versus the numbers of field, the decade and the numbers of fields that have been discovered. And you'll also see a graph which shows the volume in those fields that are discovered. You'll see at the bottom there's a whole lot of blue on the right-hand section of the lower right graph. And you'll see that the more we move towards the present, the blue tends to disappear. And it's replaced with large sections of red, which are very, very small oil wells. They don't contain much. Those are typically what you think of as the fracking wells. And in order to get a better sense of the fracking process and what that kind of looks like as it relates to production and consumption, on the right, you see another graph at the top above the dotted line. You have conventional resources. You see it labels at kind of 90% of the world production. And below that, you see a dotted line, which is the price or technological limit, and below that, the energy in equals energy out. So what this is a breakdown of is the availability of oil would be considered everything that actually exists within that triangle, and the low-hanging fruit would be what exists above that kind of white dashed line. The things that are harder to get would be below that, but once you hit that black dotted line, you're reaching a limit where the price and the technology that are available are really determining whether the oil is worth it to produce. And then once you hit that black line, you reach a point of, even if you produce it, what you have available at the end to consume is less than it took to actually produce it. So you can see there is a huge amount of oil that exists below that black solid line, but because it's below a return on investment of energy, because it's below that 1-to-1 line, it's a sink. You're putting in a lot of energy, but you're not getting anything out. Now on the left, you see a graph. The kind of jagged line is graphing the U.S. production of oil, and that red line that you see is Hubbard's curve. The Hubbard model, or also referred to as the peak model, is kind of a bell graph that's superimposed on the production of oil, and it's done in order to show the rate at which we are able to extract and consume any finite resource. So recently, if you've been watching the news, you probably noticed a lot of talk about the energy independence that we're going to be having in the United States, speaking particularly from what we see in this country on the news, has really entered an age of new oil and energy production and energy independence. And you can actually see on the graph, it would look to be the case. You have this huge spike, and you notice that red line, the curve, which it looked as if we were following, is all of a sudden really off base. It's no longer representing what's actually going on. And that's, as you can see from the first quote, that strong growth in U.S. crude oil production is primarily attributed to growing volumes of light crude oil produced from onshore tight oil formations. Those are the shale oils, and what the technique used to extract that is fracking. With the decline, though, in gasoline prices in 2015, it's been rendered uneconomical to drill these subprime wells. It's on that last slide, that dashed line is kind of where we're at. And then you see that black solid line below it. That's where the return on investment is negative. It costs more to extract fracking gas oil than it does to produce it. It's not really worth it. So while you hear a lot of news, and you'll see that this graph here on the left is really touted as showing that we don't have an energy problem, it actually, once you have a grasp of the energy return on investment, you realize that we're now sinking a lot of our very scarce resources that are left into something that costs more than we're actually getting out of it, which is pretty frightening from my perspective. And to put this in perspective as well, what you'd think of from kind of the conventional drilling, not the hydrofracking, the amount of oil that you're getting out now for every barrel of oil that you invest into it, it's about 1 to 5. If you look at, say, the 1950s, it's actually 1 to 50. So if you kind of compare the two spots on the graph, you'll see that we're actually on the end of the curve that just about is equidistant from the peak from 1950. So often when you state this, you get a blank stare, or someone says, well, what about renewable energies? Which is a great question. So Charles Hall, who is the originator of the concept of energy return on investment, along with Howard Odum and many others, he's a tenured professor. He's not funded by any special interest, and he's considered one of the most respected, cited, and unbiased scientific writers in energy return on investment. He recently wrote a book, Spain's Photovoltaic Revolution. This book looks at a real-life photovoltaic installation at large scale in Spain, which has an ideal, it's considered a realistic, ideal sunny climate. And the energy return on investment for those photovoltaic panels came to about 2.45. Now, if you look at the figures that are often cited by the photovoltaic producers, the panel producers, you get something like 1 to 6. But it seems in real world cases, it's less than half of that, which is most concerning when you consider that that's still less than we're getting right now with conventional, with the scraping the bottom of the barrel of conventional oil production that we have. So another great study, or the Hirsch report, the second quote at the bottom comes from this, and it's a study done that looks at energy consumption. It looks at infrastructure production, and it kind of compares them in a setting that was commissioned by the U.S. Department of Energy. It's really interesting to read up on, but the gist that you get is that viable mitigation options exist both on the supply and demand sides, but to have substantial impact, they must be initiated more than a decade in advance of peaking. So if you look at looking back on that graph, it showed a peak sometime in the 70s, but it's important to remember that that's just U.S. production. If you look at world production, though, it's estimated that happened in roughly 2000, 2003, 2005, 2000. It really depends. And it's hard to know until further down the line. But what you do know is that this report came out 10 years after the peak. And it's quite clear that without acting at least a minimum of a decade before, you're not going to be able to mitigate the most extreme issues on the supply and demand sides, and you'll run into huge issues when it comes to energy supply within industrial civilization, which I'm sure you can imagine is quite problematic. And just a note on the Hirsch report, it predicted that you would have had to have acted 20 years before the peak in order to mitigate the problem without any interruption with supply lines. So how might others view this situation? Brian and I recently finished the book, The Ecology of Law, by Friedrich Capra, and there's a great quote in here having to do with, again, as I said, you can explain this to many people, but often you get these kind of blank stares. But the reason for that might be found in this quote: the illusion of perpetual growth and progress and an irrational faith in technology is certainly a powerful ideology. And I completely agree, And to understand how powerful it is, in the same book, you see it, from my perspective at least, the writer is unable to break from that ideology. They also say in the same book that in transportation, we have hybrid electric cars achieving fuel efficiencies 2 to 3 times that of standard cars, and that the development of efficient hydrogen fuel cells promises to inaugurate a new era in energy production, which certainly sounds optimistic and utopian, but it seems to fly in the face of the best studies that we have on creating infrastructure in order to respond to the energy crisis. More from the ecology of law, it's great to understand this energy problem in context of where you might be living at the time. So we know that the current footprint is 1.5, but it's only 1.5 because many people in the world live far below the standard of a one planet footprint currently. In North America, the majority of individuals are living with a 5 as their footprint, and Europe is more like 3. Understanding the huge discrepancy between those two, you need to understand the geography and design of cities between Europe and the United States. This is really important when it comes to creating localized solutions and regional solutions. The United States was developed largely during the advent of the automobile. There's a wonderful joke that Europeans think that, laugh that Americans think 100 years is a long time, and Americans laugh when they hear that Europeans think that 100 miles is a long distance. You know, we travel all the time. Most of the resources we consume on a regular basis in North America have traveled a long, long distance. And that just isn't the same in Europe, although in Europe, you're still looking at 3 times the amount of resources being consumed as the planet can actually support. So a lot of times the response that we hear to this is one of, and this actually followed, Brian had mentioned a few presentations back, the stages of grief, and I kind of found an interesting comparison as I moved through the book and some of these stages. The first was bargaining, I believe. And the second quote on the right kind of shows, again, how pervasive this ideology is. Should car companies produce any kind of SUV? Should the 1% fly on private aircrafts because they can afford it? Should companies be able to maintain intensive cattle breeding now that we know the devastating impact of excessive meat consumption? It's a mindset of kind of objectifying and externalizing the problem. It's not something that I can do anything about. These car companies need to fix their ways. The 1% needs to fix their ways. The cattle industry and the meat in the food industry needs to fix their ways. So one of the most important quotes I found from the ecology of law that really speaks to conceptualizing the use of a common is that treated as a commons, the main purpose is to save as much of it as possible by investing in community eco-literacy and limiting all of the waste. So what future are we trying to create? This is from a paper by Christian Arnsberger. Interestingly, the lucid recognition that neoliberalism has hastened ecological apocalypse is leading to the re-intentionalization of formerly non-intentional communities, such as older neighborhoods and older market towns, which, under the influence of heightened environmental consciousness, are in fits and starrs and in various shades, ranging from commercial hypocrisy to genuine alternatives, finding a new intentionality that has been lost with Reaganism and Thatcherism, broke trade unions and social solidarity, and left city centers impoverished and vacant. In the ecology of law, it's called ecodesign, which is the careful meshing of our human purposes with the larger patterns and flows of the natural world. Reducing the catastrophic impact of exploitative activities and excessive economic growth while accumulating ecological integrity and social justice. This requires using community knowledge in order to preventatively control the economic projects and practices that can endanger the future through a variety of sophisticated participatory institutions, which happens today only as an exception. So you can see the importance of attention and intention here. The attention to yourself as you act within a system, and your intentions with going about, for instance, designing solutions. If you're not taking into consideration things like energy return on investments, you find yourself investing a whole lot of money and scarce resources into something like a photovoltaic plan for your country like Spain did. It didn't work out all too well for Spain. Just an aside that kind of speaks to the predicament that they're in now. With the 2008-2009 housing bubble burst in the United States, the reason that Spain was so highly affected, one of the reasons Spain was so highly susceptible to issues, was that they had largely subsidized this photovoltaic movement. And as a response of that being the case, now most of the companies, a large majority, over 50% of the companies that were producing these panels or importing them and doing the installations have all gone belly under, or belly up, excuse me. So the notion of contraction and convergence when it comes to use and consumption of resources is one that's been stressed. To understand that, eco-literate societies will function within a balance of an ecological and social budget. So that 5 footprint of the United States, that 3 footprint of Europe, has to drop to 1. And the sub-1 footprints of individuals living in other regions needs to come up to 1. Another from Christian Arnsberger, within the worldwide constraining frame, there is a need for various versions of ecological democracy. It combines 2 crucial elements. The first is an institutionalization of the long run, so as to embed the long descent into our democratic decisions. And this long descent is that far side of the peak oil graph. It's moving further and further away from the bell. And a new fundamental human right to experiment radically at the socio-ecological level, inscribed within a constitutional principle of democratic experimentalism, or the expression of societies placing a positive value on what he refers to as the muddling through process, and on creative dissensus. So not trying a blanket solution for Europe and the United States, but instead working with the idea that different solutions and different takes on the problem gives you a much better likelihood of coming up with a solution that does work. So what do we need to let go of, and what do we need to learn? This is the matrix of economic evolution, and I want to draw attention to the technology column. You'll notice that there's kind of a stair step of white cells moving from Mother Nature at 0. At 1, it's serfdom and slavery under labor. At 2, it's capital, industrial capital. And at 3, it's technology, the second industrial revolution. Those are supposed to be the focal points, the areas of most importance as you move down those levels. So a society moved from 0 to 1.0. Serfdom and slavery was really the key area under within society, so that change in labor was really key to that shift from 0 to 1, and so forth. So at 4, you can see all of them are highlighted because a approach that takes the entire system into mind is really what 4.0 level work is. That's what the eco-centric awareness is. So kind of highlighting or zooming in on the technology column. If you read the last cell, it's human-centric technologies. And then it talks about the 3rd industrial revolution, ICT, renewable energy, and smart grid. Limited by the illusion of perpetual growth and progress and an irrational faith in technology, though, this 3rd industrial revolution is often framed by renewable energies and smart grid infrastructure, the internet, and 3D printing, which are all great things, some of which we have access to now. But this type of technological development, when disconnected from nature and labor, really presents itself as problematic because it increasingly utilizes scarce resources and ignores ecodesign principles. That's why you end up with situations like what happened with Spain, where now you have all of this infrastructure which has to be maintained effectively indefinitely. at high costs of energy in order to maintain. And the notion that that is a human-centric technology ignores the scope of the supply chain that we're required to put that in place and will be indefinitely required to maintain that. So where do we need help or input? This is a picture of from Luck Avenue of 430 Church Avenue. This is a property that we are currently in the process of revitalizing in the downtown Roanoke area. Looking at these human-centric technologies and where we are currently at with envisioning and actually prototyping already with these technologies is exploring energy capture, energy production, and energy storage. We're looking at waste management, and that is not in the sense of where your trash goes, but that's actually in the sense of human waste management. Where does your urine go, and where does your everything else go when you flush it down the drains? You know, it's nice to have out of sight, out of mind, but not taking into account the energy that goes into a situation like that. You know, currently we don't really have human-centric technologies that take care of that. We have large industrial systems that don't account for the quality of handling these wastes. Looking at urban food production, producing in spaces where soil either doesn't exist, it's limited, or it's highly polluted. And then looking at maintaining standards of living while simultaneously mitigating energy consumption. So how do you move from a 5-world footprint to a 1-world footprint while maintaining your standard of living? What things are important, what things are not contributing to that standard of living that maybe seem like they do because we're not having a conversation that focuses on quality. And another really important point that we have yet to face in its full form, other than working right now, and as I stated with Friedrich Capra's book, looking at ecology and law, there is a need to affect a systemic shift, at least for us locally and regionally, in our zoning laws in order to allow these technologies that are referred to above to actually be able to be implemented and utilized and taken to scale. So that comes to the conclusion of our broadcasted portion. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks. See you next time.